This lesson is on APA, why APA, and how APA works. In this lesson, I will go over some slides that are linked here, as well as a sample academic article, and a couple of places to look for sources and quoting. We'll have more lessons on that in the future as we're moving through the different parts of your paper. I'm going to click here and open up the slides. And I'm going to go ahead now and open them with Google Slides. So they look like this on the screen. And then I'm going to go ahead and hop into presentation mode. So it's going to take up the whole screen now. So this is some nuts and bolts based on the 7th edition of the APA manual with information on citations, punctuation, and word choices. The first thing I'm going to talk about is why APA and not MLA. What are the basic reasons why we have these two major citation styles? And to do that, I'm going to give a little bit of history. Now, the differences between APA and MLA are similar to differences between other citation styles. APA is most like citation styles that include dates. So for engineering, there is a specialty citation called IEEE that's run by the International Engineering Association, but it is a variation of APA. So if you know APA, then you'll do well with most of the types of citations that include dates. So like everything else, APA style has a history, and it was developed by social and behavioral scientists starting in 1929 to standardize scientific writing. And the reason why scientists realized that they needed to have a specific writing style was for these three reasons that you see bulleted here: to avoid ambiguity, avoid inconsistency, and avoid perpetuating problems. In other words, if the writing is confusing, then the information isn't getting across the way that it should. And on top of that, some of the scientific reasoning and evidence can come across incorrectly, which could be a huge problem when you're conducting scientific studies. I'd say any discipline wants their information to be correct, but with certain scientific experiments and medicine, we are actually talking about problems that could lead to improper medicine and all sorts of terrible things that could happen. You can use your imagination, I'm sure, with that. So APA is meant to do these things: ease reading by codifying and clarifying, like basically set things up in very clear ways of explaining. Even if APA doesn't seem that way to you, it is much less, people use the word flowery, but it's less complex in a lot of the way the sentences run than what you would see in writing that's associated with the humanities, or even, I'd say mostly the humanities there, because your social sciences, in fact, use APA. That's criminal justice and sociology, psychology, of course, because APA is the American Psychological Association. So what is it supposed to do? Standardize writing about data, reliability, results, and experiments. So the rules are in place so that these important parts of scientific writing are always regular. So the goal is to be neutral and objective. So above all, the goal is of neutrality and objectivity. In other words, not to have bias, and also not to be subjective. In other words, opinion needs to be avoided in scientific writing styles. If there is research that involves the researcher's point of view, and that is absolutely part of certain fields, like if you have an interviewer conducting interviews, they need to explain their own position in an interview or sometimes in an experiment. And that actually seems subjective, but there are rules in place for writers to explain their own position so that you can understand that the objectivity there is that they are admitting their own position. I don't know if that came across well. I'm going to try to explain that again, but sometimes in, let's say, psychology or social science or even anthropology, the person who is doing the interviewing or the study might be involved in the situation. Part of APA is that they have to admit that. So even though it might seem subjective sometimes, they have to admit it by the rules, and that actually makes it more objective because they're admitting that they might influence what's in a study or a piece of writing. So these are some of the ways that APA is much less subjective than writing that is seen in the humanities. So you should not see the same types of use of metaphor or stylistic flourishes like the dramatic opening hook. Typically, you're not going to see that in an APA paper. It is less attention grabbing because the emphasis is on detachment, and the emphasis in APA writing is also on structure. These types of ideas are, compared to MLA, revelatory. They reveal philosophical differences between APA and MLA. So in MLA, what most students have learned, the focus is on creativity, the role of the artist, the role of the voice, and the role of quoting and language. In other words, the focus is on style and creativity much more than the things that we see in APA that I'm describing up here in the previous slide. In the humanities, writers in the humanities introduce ideas with a discussion of particular cases and then proceed to more general conclusions. In social sciences, writers begin with a consideration of general principles and the introduction, move to a particular data set, and then return to general principles. So moving from specific to general, over here, you can imagine your triangle with the point at the top in the humanities. So that is your inductive reasoning because it's increasing as the paper goes on. In the social sciences, there's a back and forth between the types of reasoning. So you could go back and if you wanted to explore this more, we have some slides posted on inductive and deductive reasoning, but I'll just say we've gone over that in class. You don't really have to go over it again, just to say that that's the idea behind what you see on this slide. There are also many technical differences between MLA and APA. You'll see that in the headings, the emphasis on the dates. There are not nearly as many quotes that are worked into the writing, and that there are many, many, many more in-text citations, and that will have the years and the last names of the researchers in the parentheses, depending on how the in-text citation is done. I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. Here's some basics of APA with citing and quoting some sources. So here I have a link to the APA blog, which is where you get a list of common non-academic sources. Things like if you were citing a YouTube video or you were citing a tweet or something like that, those sources are available on this blog. You can go ahead and pause and read the slide, and I'm going to move on to the next one just for the sake of time. I'm going to talk through a couple of the samples that I have posted here. And this sample, there is a hanging indent here, but it's a little bit hard to see because it's only in a couple spaces. The formatting actually shifted around a little bit when I loaded the video. You can tell that because the size of the bullets over here are, they're kind of huge. So when you make your hanging indent in Google Doc, your Google Doc, it'll automatically come in about 5 spaces. So it'll be a little bit more than what you see here. So if you're citing from a journal, you have the last name and then the initials only of the authors. And the reason it's done that way is not to emphasize the gender of the writer. So you don't know looking at this if what the gender is of any of these writers. So you have the last name and then the initials. You have an and if There's like 3 like you see here. Notice where your commas are. And then there's the year. Then there's the title of the journal article. And notice here, that's kind of a weird feature that's not like other citation styles that you're probably familiar with. Only the first letter of the title is capitalized. The rest is not. And then the journal is here, and it is in italics and has normal capitalization rules, a comma, the volume and the issue number. And this is in italics and this is not. The page numbers, and then something called a DOI. DOI is a number that travels with each document. So it doesn't matter what database it's in, you can find it based on this special number that's assigned. The good news is that if you've looked at the other videos and you're doing this in order, you will know by now that there's a magic button in the databases for the articles you'll find at the ODU library, and it'll actually make the citation for you. So I'm breaking down the parts here, but you don't have to really remember any of this. You just have to double check them when you put them in your paper. In-text citations look different than MLA as well. So there's a couple things that are different in APA. Every single time you have the last name of an author, you're always going to have the year of the publication immediately after it. That's something I want you to like 100% like write down, burn it in your brain, star, underline, highlight, bring it to your attention that you get in that habit, last name and then a year every single time. You can see with this sentence that it introduces a quote from the article. And then the page number is here with a P. In MLA, there is no P in the citation. Here's another version of it. And then down at the bottom, when the last name isn't in the sentence itself, it goes in the parentheses right here. So Jones is our person. Jones is not here. It says she instead of Jones. So it's Jones 1998, page 199. This is a different way of doing the same citation that you have above. Probably a little bit confusing, and that's okay to be confused now. The more you look at samples and examples, the more you'll begin to understand what the patterns are. For block quotations, you can see that it's indented. When you have one that's 40 words or more, you have to block it off. You'll see some of this is in Latin. It doesn't matter because it's the formatting we're talking about. You can see it's blocked off as in it's all indented. There are no quotation marks because actually indenting it takes place of the quotation marks. And then you have the citation after. Pause and just take a look at that in a minute and see the description of what you see on the screen right here. Don't worry again about it being in Latin. That's not what matters. What matters is that you just see the pattern. If you chop out words inside a quotation, you're supposed to use ellipses. Go ahead and pause and read what's on the slide. So one of the things that is going to happen is that you're going to read articles and use articles that might have more than one author. And if you do, the sentence structures work the way that you see down here. So if their names are in the sentence, it's just like before, Jones, and then we're going to add Watkins, and then there's 2006. If their names are not in your sentence like this, you cite them in the parentheses together, the last names, and then the year. It's still, I realize, very abstract to look at all these different rules. We're going to go look at them in an actual article, so it's going to start to make sense. So just like the other, I want you to pause. The other slides where I say pause and just read through it. I'll tell you the most common mistake that students make typing is that they put the period after the ET and not after the AL. And if you read that little bit at the bottom, this is an abbreviation. So that's why the period is there. But ET is actually the word and in Latin. And it's part of APA to say, okay, when you have 3 to 5 authors, instead of listing them all out, after the first time that they're listed out, you abbreviate. 6 or more authors, it's et al. From the very beginning. Sometimes you're writing and you're citing a source that's in another source. This is how you structure that, as cited in. You might have seen it in MLA as quoted in, but in APA it's as cited in. Again, bear with me. I know it's confusing right now, but you're going to have repeats of some of these. And when you look at an actual paper, again, I think it's going to make a lot more sense. So what if you paraphrase? Well, if you're just changing a few words around, it's too close to the original. And unlike MLA, you actually cite when you paraphrase. You'll see that come up in some other lessons. On this slide, you see an example of a paraphrase on the original is on the left, the paraphrase in the paper is on the right. I want you to pause and I want you to compare these two things. Okay, so now you should have paused and compared. You should have read these two things and looked at the difference. And I'm going to go over a couple other things in APA. Up until just last year, a writer had to do pronouns like this, like he or she. You might have actually been taught that at some point in your writing. It is now correct and desirable to use they because it is gender neutral. Again, you can pause and look at the slide. You can also follow along with the slides on your own. The rest of this slideshow I'm not going to go over now because it's more advanced APA, but I left it in here in case any of you end up wanting some of that information for your major. You can just kind of click through the slides and see what's there. I'm going to head on back over to the schedule, and I'm going to click here to show you a sample academic article. I co-authored this with another professor at ODU. Oops, I don't want to open it as a Google Doc. Yikes. That will look terrible. I'm going to, sorry about this, open it this way. I'm going to show you APA at work. So as I wrote it, I don't know APA well enough. I don't know that anybody does that. You don't have to look up some of the things when you're actually writing. So the whole time I wrote this article, co-wrote the article, we wrote it together, I had to look up all these rules all the time. So you'll see how crazy the citations are in here. Like the very first sentence has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 citations in it. That's kind of typical of APA. Will yours be like that? No. So I don't want you to worry. I just want to show you how it works. At most, you're going to have 3 because you only have 3 sources. And the only part of that of your work that would happen is in the proposal section of it. So it's not going to be quite as complicated as what you see here. But what I can show you is a reflection of those lessons I've been talking about. Also, you'll notice that is not a very catchy first sentence. The other thing you're going to see is that this particular journal actually has these as links, so you could click and go to these different sources. The journal itself did that. We did not when we were writing it. So here's APA at work. Again, these just huge lists of authors and the years, and notice every single time you see a last name, there's a year with it through the whole paper. Look at all those citations. I can't even tell you how long it took. I think we did research for like, I don't know, on and off for a year. And then we wrote it over the course of several months together. We had to make the tables and all kinds of stuff. What you're doing is not like this, but I wanted you to see a APA published paper and talk about what you're going to see when you're starting to look up articles on your own. And now, last but not least, you're probably very tired of these lectures at this point. I am going to show you that one of the go-to places to look things up, as always, is going to be your Purdue University Online Writing Lab, the OWL. And the OWL has a whole section on APA, and it also has a search bar up here at the top. It does have annoying pop-up ads, but you could go on here and you can look up different things, how to do it in APA. You can also look at the sample paper. I'm giving you sample papers that my students have written, so this is a compliment to what I give you. I'm going to actually click on this so it blows up on the whole screen. I have this link several places throughout our lessons, but here you will see a sample APA paper with all the explanations here linked for you. All right, that is the end of the last of your video lectures for week 12.